Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for turning out today. My name is John Siriati. I'm the coordinator for Hart for President. And now at this time, it's my honor to introduce the next President of the United States, Senator Gary Hart.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John. Thank you all for being here. The urgency of this national election is becoming increasingly apparent to the people not only of Iowa and New Hampshire, but all across this country. People of this country know that the choice of our national leader in 1984 is critical to this nation's future. The people of this country are beginning to realize that we cannot tolerate 4 more years of Reaganomics for the rich and Cold War hostile foreign policy that jeopardizes the future of mankind on this planet. The people of this state are beginning to realize that they have the power to change American history. The Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primary, indeed the entire nomination race, represents an opportunity for the people of this nation through the Democratic Party and its new leadership to change the course of this nation's future. And that is what this 1984 election is all about. Ronald Reagan is unacceptable. Ronald Reagan represents the worst of our past. We cannot have a society that continues to divide itself along economic class lines, racial lines, and gender lines. If this nation is to survive and succeed and thrive in the 80s and 90s, this must be a nation that unites itself and pulls itself back together behind the national interest and not the interests of greed and privilege. And yet, the people of Iowa and the Democratic Party across this country understand that the traditional Democratic leadership will not suffice. It will not suffice to win this election, and it will not suffice to govern this country. Leaders in this party who are bound to old arrangements, to special interest, and to deals that have been made with constituency groups are not leaders that can direct this nation's future. If a president goes into office beholden to a whole array of special interests, whose campaigns have been financed by political action committees and by special interest groups, that leader cannot identify the future and unite the American people behind it. There are those in this race who have given away so much of their own independence to govern this country in the future in order to get endorsements, in order to raise money, in order to appear to be front runners, that I concern myself a great deal, and I think others in this party concern themselves, that those individuals will not have the independence of judgment or of decision to point this country in the direction it must go in the 80s and 90s. The issue in this race is this country's future versus its past. That is what the choice before the Democratic Party of Iowa and all across this country is. I believe there is an alternative. That alternative is the new leadership of this party. That leadership represents, first of all, a commitment to solving problems and not just debating old ideologies. Nowhere is that issue seen more than in the question of national defense and national security. Ronald Reagan represents a blank checkbook to the Pentagon, not just a check, but an entire checkbook for everything every general and admiral and hawk in this country wants. Weapon systems like the MX that make this country weaker, and weapon systems like the B-1 that are unnecessary and wasteful of taxpayers' dollars. This nation is spending itself weak in a mad pursuit for security which will not be found in this unlimited and mindless nuclear arms race. And likewise, the American people who voted against the Democratic Party in 1978 and 80 will not return to the Democratic fold and a Democratic candidate if they believe our leadership only represents arbitrary cuts in defense, even at the expense of the security of this country. I believe I believe our party can present leadership to this country in the area of national defense and economics and other areas that avoids the pitfalls of the past. This country must reform its military institutions. We must have the most effective conventional forces and not just the most expensive. And we must link military reform with a dramatic reversal of a dangerous and unnecessary nuclear arms race. I think we must also innovate in our economy to solve the challenges of the 1980s. That means directing private investment towards rebuilding and modernizing this nation's basic manufacturing base, where billions of private dollars, if necessary, guaranteed by the federal government, go into the modernization of our plant and our equipment and the training of our workers, so that by the end of this decade, our keystone industries are as efficient and modern and productive as any nation on earth. And I think this country must put millions of Americans back to work repairing and rebuilding the basic public facilities of this nation. And I think, finally, we must have open and aggressive trade policies. If this nation follows Democratic leaders who want to erect trade barriers, the state of Iowa first and then other states to follow, will experience a kind of economic downturn we have not seen since the Great Depression. We do not have the luxury of protectionism. This country cannot pursue the course of economic surrender. It will mean the loss of family farms and hundreds of thousands of jobs in the farm implement industry and other industries all across this country. And I, for one, as a leader of this party and the next President of the United States, do not intend for this country to surrender economically in the 1980s. And finally, the new leadership of this country has learned a lesson from Vietnam. We learned a lesson that Ronald Reagan has not learned, and that is we cannot militarize our foreign policy. We cannot expect to condition events in the Third World, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia by the deployment of American military forces. We cannot send our sons off to become the bodyguards of dictators in El Salvador and hostages in Lebanon. And we cannot on the Democratic side, have leaders afraid to speak out. We cannot have a nominee in this crucial election race who waited for 16 months to say that it was time for our Marines to come home from Lebanon. We cannot have a nominee who took 18 days to decide whether the invasion of Grenada was a good idea and then supported it. We cannot have a nominee of this party who continued to support our involvement in Vietnam month after month after month after many people in this country realized it was a disastrous policy. What this country is looking for is not just political leadership. This country is looking for moral leadership, and that means a willingness to speak out before it is popular and before public consensus is formed. There are those in this race who are saying to the people of the Democratic Party, including in Iowa, the race is over, that you have no choice but to ratify a decision made by a handful of political and labor figures in Washington, that the people of Iowa have only to vote for an individual already designated by the leadership of certain organizations, by the congressional leaders of this party, and by those who have issued their individual and collective endorsements, that you have only to ratify that decision. And some are saying that because that decision has been made, that it's necessary to vote to send that front runner a message. Well, I think we can do better than send a message in this race. I think we can send to those leaders in Washington and to the American people a president. And I think that's what the people of Iowa ought to do. is to support a candidate in this race who does represent this party and this nation's future. Not to send the American people a signal, but to send this country a president who is prepared to govern in the difficult new challenges of the 1980s. The people of Iowa have a choice. You have a choice, and as I said before, you have the power to change the course of American history. I think we have no alternative but to move to a new generation of leadership that represents new ideas and new approaches, rooted in the values and the principles of the Democratic Party. The future is ours to grasp. We can begin to do that next Monday in Iowa and follow that up in New Hampshire and beyond. If we present to the American people a nominee of the 1980s and 90s, this party will succeed. If we present a nominee of the past, I fear that we will fail and we will be stuck with the ultimate disaster of 4 more years of Ronald Reagan. The stakes are too high. The choice is yours. I ask for your help, and with your help, I intend to be the nominee of the Democratic Party and the next President of the United States. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Be glad to try to answer your questions or receive your endorsements. Yes.
Could I hear your stand on education?
My stand is that education has to become this nation's #1 domestic priority in the 1980s. That means not only repairing the damage done by Ronald Reagan, restoring cuts in funds from programs ranging all the way from school lunch programs for the poorest children in our society in public schools, up to Pell Grants and guaranteed student loans for middle and lower income students going on to college and university. That must be done just to get back to where we were in the 1970s. But that was not enough. For the past number of years, including, unfortunately, before Ronald Reagan became president, this country was underinvesting in education. We were doing so at the detriment of this country's economic security and economic competitiveness in the 1980s and 90s. We must be for education not simply because it's an attractive thing for this party to represent, but because for the first time in this nation's history, our ability to educate and train our workforce is absolutely central to our ability to compete in the international marketplace. That means, in my judgment, increasing that national investment even more, even over what it was before Ronald Reagan took his meat axe to the federal education budget. It means passing the American Defense Education Act, which I introduced 3 years ago, to increase national financial assistance to local school districts, to increase teacher salaries, to hire teachers in areas where we're deficient, including, for example, in high school physics in 44 states in this union, to create teacher training and retraining centers, and to introduce new techniques into the classroom. This is not only for science and math and physics and engineering and the other areas where we're deficient. It's across the board to include the humanities and social studies and all the rest. This country is falling behind. It's falling behind not only in the sciences, it's falling behind in all areas. And if we intend to compete with other industrialized nations, we're going to have to reverse that declining investment. I think it also means a president of the United States going on television and using the power of the White House to tell the American people how important education is, to enlist the cooperation of parents in reducing the amount of time their children watch television, to tell the young people of this country that excellence in education is something this nation will prize. Perhaps the President of the United States might be well advised to invite some teachers to have dinner in the White House just to symbolize what commitment that president has and this nation has to make our education system the best in the world. Yes.
Do you consider Israel an important part of the United States?
Yes, I do. and I consider our 30 or 35-year policy of perpetuating an informal alliance with Israel to be a central part of our security interest in the Middle East, not only because of Israel's unique position as a democratic ally, but because it is in this country's national security interest to have a reliable friend in that region. Israel has consistently supported United States policy, not only in the Middle East but elsewhere, occasionally even when that wasn't the best policy. But it does represent a continued pattern of three and a half decades of friendship, which has been in this country's interest. I don't think we're going to get peace in the Middle East until we get the principal nations in that region back to the bargaining table under the Camp David framework, and have the first and highest priority on that negotiating agenda to be the security of Israel's borders and the survival of Israel as a nation. Yes.
What is your position on South Africa, a place where racial and economic oppression exists? And secondly, would you, as president, demand that the divestment of South Africa by appropriations?
My stand is that we must immediately enact legislation that conditions any American private investment in South Africa on that investment being for the benefit of all the people of that country. And any employment created in that nation because of American investment ought to be under fair labor employment practices that eliminate discrimination against the black majority. I would oppose any American public investment, loans or any other kind of investment, that did not go to the benefit of all the people of that country regardless of race. And finally, I would support a position which gave the government of South Africa a timetable to democratize itself, to open up its political process and its economics to the black majority, with the understanding, if that timetable, a reasonable timetable, not years but certainly months, if that timetable was not complied with, then there would be all-out economic sanctions against that government, and we would no longer do business with it. We cannot, as a nation, claim to represent certain values here at home and violate those values in the emerging nations of the world. And we cannot continue to support governments that are directly contrary to the principles that we claim to believe in here in this nation. I think we have to have a human rights policy, and I think that policy has to be applied with equal vigor to our supposed friends and allies as to our enemies. I think we have too long permitted a double standard, a hypocritical standard, to operate in our foreign policy. And I think if we care at all about the power and influence and the rights of the 2/3 to 3/4 of the people in this world that live in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, then we're going to have to follow, as painful as it might be, the same principles abroad that we claim to stand for here at home.
Yes, sir, Senator, thank you. I've been unemployed for almost 2 years, and I'm now in a job training partnership act class here provided with rate. One of the difficulties we find that the first 4 classes have supporting services. Now, there's nothing other than just the tuition in the book. For us that have families and so on, puts a hardship on them. Would you be willing to go back into some assistance, not a big deal, but just something to help?
Oh, absolutely. I am not glad for your plight, and I think that plight must end, but I'm glad to hear you speak up, because to hear this administration talk, there are no people like yourselves. This recovery has taken care of everyone, and the country's back on its feet, if you'll recall the President's State of the Union message. Certainly, the President's friends in Palm Springs are back on their feet. And I think it's worthwhile to remind people, under the kind of euphoria of this Reagan recovery, that there's still more people out of work than when Ronald Reagan took office. And I would assume that might include yourself or a lot of others like you. We not only have to have a job training program, we have to give people like yourself some assistance for their families, their children, their wives, and their dependents during the period where they're learning some skills to hopefully apply for the jobs of today and tomorrow. I think this country's got a long way to go before we build the bridge between our past and our future that does, as I suggested in my remarks, modernize our industries to increase employment in those industries and puts people to work in meaningful and necessary jobs, rebuilding and repairing our public facilities. And finally, that trains people for jobs that are going to be available in the 1980s and 90s that require different kinds of skills than we've trained our workforce for. You are the victim, as unfortunately hundreds of thousands, if not millions of others are, not only of a cruel Reagan policy that, as one economist recently wrote, is in the process of destroying the middle class. I'm afraid you're a victim of short-sightedness by political leaders in the past that did not see this transition period coming. I am now in my 10th year of office, and I and others elected in the 1970s began to send warning signals to our party in 1977 and 78 and 79 that the world was changing. We started talking about the revolution in international economics. We started talking about the revolution in our own domestic economy, from an economy principally based for 150 years on manufacturing to one increasingly based on services and technology. For our thanks, we got labels like neoliberals and Atari Democrats. But in any case, during that period, some of the older Democratic leaders were resisting the future and were saying, we're just going to hold on to the past. And I'm afraid our party and its leaders that have been in office 10, 15, 20 years that didn't see these economic revolutions coming are also responsible for some of the hardship you and others are suffering. I think our party has to share that responsibility. Ronald Reagan's only made this situation work. When I talk about moving into the future, I'm talking about addressing these twin revolutions of the internationalization of our economy and the shift of our own domestic economy here at home to one increasingly based on services. That means the bridge that has to be built between the past and the future is education, is job training, and is the total transformation of our own workforce into something in the 80s and 90s that it wasn't in the 60s and 70s.
With all the spending you're talking about job training aids, more for students, how do you plan on cutting the budget?
Well, I intend to begin by cancellation of the MX missile program and the B-1 bomber. That'll save the taxpayers at least $50 billion in the next 5 years. I also intend to offer some alternatives to weapon systems like the two new nuclear aircraft carriers that together represent an investment of about 30 or more billions of dollars in the next 10 years, including some different kinds of ships and different kinds of planes. We have to scale back on the Reagan military buildup at least $100 billion in the next 2 to 3 years, and probably more than that over the next 4 to 5 years. Not only just by, as I said before, taking an axe to the military budget, but offering more cost-effective alternatives for some of our conventional weapons, and actually spending more money than Ronald Reagan's doing in the readiness of our conventional forces and the pay and benefits for retaining our skilled military personnel. My defense budget looks an awful lot different from Ronald Reagan's, but it also looks different from some of the other Democrats. I think we also have to use our two principal entitlements programs that have to do with medical assistance, Medicare and Medicaid, to change the nature of health care in this country. This country spent about 20 or 30 billions of dollars for health care about 20 years ago. Today we're spending 300 billions of dollars, and Medicare and Medicaid are both the victims of that spiral, but they're also contributing to the spiral. This country has to have in the 1980s a system of preventive medicine, particularly for the poor and the elderly, if we intend to balance or get near balance for our federal budgets, and those reforms have to be enacted. I think we have to generate new revenues by reforming our tax laws, restoring progressivity to those tax laws so that the wealthy and the powerful in this country, both individuals and corporations, pay their fair share of taxes, and also by increasing revenues from people who are out of work today and making those out of work people taxpayers. And finally, I think we need a different monetary policy that makes interest rates lower, expands the supply of money, makes credit available for family farmers in Iowa and Colorado and elsewhere, and small businesses necessary to expand and increase economic growth in this nation. And we can combat inflation through a whole different set of approaches than just tight money and high interest rates. Yes.
In terms of equity and efficiency, what kind of tax bill do you propose as an alternative to the equity one?
Question has to do with tax reform. I believe several things. The goal of tax reform has to accommodate several principles. First is simplicity, second is equity, and the third is progressivity. I think we have to eliminate most of the itemized deductions for individuals and replace them with a reasonably high standard deduction in the range perhaps of $10,000 to $15,000 per taxpayer or tax-paying household. I would defer taxation on income up to a certain limit that is saved or productively invested to increase capital formation. And I would restore a progressive tax rate to all other income above that amount. That turns out to be an approach very similar to one that's been put forward by Senator Bradley of New Jersey and Senator Dick Gebhardt of Missouri, the so-called fair tax system. I differ from them in 1 or 2 degrees, a somewhat greater incentive for savings and investment, and also a higher rate of progressivity in the income tax laws. Yes?
How do you feel about negotiating with the Sandinistas?
Question has to do with negotiating with the Sandinistas. First of all, I think this country ought to end its covert war against the government of Nicaragua, and we ought to increase our overtures to those elements of that government which are genuinely nationalistic and patriotic, and do what we can to strengthen their hand as opposed to the hardline Marxist-Leninist ideologues. Now, I'm not saying that in Nicaragua any more than in Lebanon we can impose our will on that nation. But I think by wholeheartedly supporting and promoting the Contadora proposals of demilitarization of the entire region, establishment of a regional network or capability for conflict resolution and negotiation, and finally by some long-range economic development programs, which I would use mostly American technicians in, not just American dollars, I think we can reverse a whole lot of very dangerous trends in that region. We can't do it so long as we're overtly, covertly trying to overthrow the government, so long as we're militarizing Honduras, and so long as we're providing the guns and ammunition and support for the death squads in El Salvador. All of those policies have to be reversed. And I think we have to align ourselves very strongly with the other democratic nations. Yes?
You seem to be talking a lot about innovation in government. I'm wondering, realistically, what would you do differently in negotiations on nuclear arms, weaponry, and nuclear proliferation? How can you tell me that Gary Hart would be able to deal with questions in a different way than Walter Mondale or other politicians you might brand as politicians of the past?
Well, I'll tell you my arms control agenda, and you can reach your own conclusions. Unlike those who support only the freeze, I support the freeze approach very strongly. But I support it as one of a series of simultaneous negotiations that seek to address almost every aspect of the nuclear arms race. And I will lay those negotiations out, or those objectives. First is to freeze or negotiate a verifiable freeze on the production of new nuclear weapon systems. Second, and uniquely among the candidates, I am proposing a negotiated freeze on the production of plutonium, the material used to make nuclear weapons. Third, I think I was one of the first in the Congress, and I believe the first in this race, to call for the establishment of a joint crisis monitoring capability between ourselves and the Soviets to address a looming problem in the nuclear arms race, and that's the accidental or miscalculated use of nuclear weapons, which past SALT negotiations, present freeze, and present START negotiations do not address. That is, in a word, a capability involving American and Soviet military and civilian personnel to monitor activities on both sides to eliminate the possibility of mistaken launches. Fourth, I would put together the strategic and intermediate range talks in Geneva, restart those talks immediately, and put those two sets of talks together so that the Soviets can address what I think are legitimate concerns about the vague areas between what are strategic and what are theater weapons or intermediate range weapons, all of which represent a direct threat to their own security. I would also seek international negotiations on a multinational level to prohibit the sale or availability of nuclear technology and material to other nations in the world, to halt what I call the horizontal nuclear arms race, the spread or proliferation of nuclear materials and technology to other nations, which, if it's not halted, will reach to almost 30 countries by the end of this century. And I would get all of those talks started as quickly as possible and not wait for one of them to succeed before the others start. That's a very ambitious arms control agenda, but it addresses several aspects of the nuclear arms race that I don't think the others are addressing. One is the problem of the materials used to make nuclear weapons and the need to stop producing that. Second is the possibility of accidental or miscalculated nuclear war. Third is the proliferation problem, that is to say the spread of nuclear weapons into the third world and very quickly, I think, to terrorist organizations. And fourth is the whole notion of simultaneous negotiations. We can have teams of negotiators going all at once on a whole variety of issues. We don't need to wait to succeed in one area before we begin to address the others. I'll let the other candidates address their own arms control agenda, and you can reach your own conclusions as to which of us has the broadest compass and the broadest perspective, and for that matter, the deepest commitment. Unlike other candidates in this race, I don't claim to be better on arms control than anyone else, or more deeply committed to arms control. I frankly think among all the candidates, our records of the records of Vice President Mondale, of Senator McGovern, of Senator Cranston, and myself are roughly equivalent. I think in this area, the area of broad-based arms control negotiations, I have demonstrated more creativity and more thoughtfulness, if you will, than perhaps anyone else in the race. But I don't claim to be better politically, diplomatically, or morally on the issue than others in this race. Yes?
Yeah, two questions. One, what are your plans with the space program? And the other, as far as immigration policy, do you have any specific ideas?
Well, I would hope, given very serious budget constraints, this country could continue world leadership in peaceful exploration of space. I am absolutely opposed to the militarization of space, and frankly, I would add that as one more item on this negotiating agenda. And that is, this country ought to invite the Soviet Union to the bargaining table to enact an agreement or a treaty which absolutely banned and prohibited any weapons in space, including anti-satellite weapons, including laser beams, particle weapons, or anything like that. That was a resolution which Senator Tsongas and I introduced over a year ago, and it ought to be part of the bargaining policy of this nation. Clearly, we need the capability to monitor Soviet activities through satellites and the rest, and we have to continue that. But we don't need to militarize space, and we certainly cannot afford economically or diplomatically or militarily the mad kind of Star Wars approach this president is pursuing. I don't see enormous amounts of new dollars for space exploration so long as we have $200 billion deficits, so long as we have 3 million children who are not receiving school lunches that were before Ronald Reagan, elderly people without energy assistance, and young people who can't go on to college because they don't have a student loan. I think we have to fix our own domestic priorities, reverse the Reagan priorities, get this country on a sound economic footing, and then I think we'll have some more resources to expand that space exploration. We need reforms of our immigration policies. Many of those reforms, or much of the reforms that I would support, are contained in legislation called the Simpson-Mazzoli Bill. I did not support and do not support that legislation for one particular reason. The way the employer sanctions are designed in that bill, they openly invite employers to discriminate in hiring against Asian Americans, against Hispanics, against even black Americans, for fear that if they hire an undocumented worker or a falsely documented worker, they may end up going to jail or suffering severe civil penalties. What I tried to do when the bill was in the Senate was amend that legislation to protect the civil liberties of American citizens of racial minorities, so that they would at the very least have a cause of action in the courts if they were discriminated against in employment because of those employer sanctions. That amendment unfortunately failed, and because of it I could not support that bill. If we can make that change, then I think that approach to immigration reform is one that goes almost all the direction we have to go in this country.
This will have to be the last question.
Yes.
Senator, would you deal directly with the PLO prior to it recognizing Israel?
No, I would not. When the nations in the Middle East are prepared to guarantee Israel's survival and the security of its borders, and when the Palestinians, whether represented by the PLO or anyone else, are willing to accept that agreement, then I think that the parties in the region can then get down to the question of the long-term homeland or place or position or status of the Palestinians. But I don't see that happening in any regard until the issue of Israel's borders is concluded. Let me thank all of you for being here. I need your help on Monday and beyond, and with your help we're going to win. Thank you.